With two of the top three JUCO players in America becoming Cowboys, it seems to be slightly indicative of how this rebuild is going to look a lot more like Dion and a little less like Gundy.
You are Locked On Oklahoma State, your daily podcast on the Oklahoma State Cowboys, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Howdy, y'all, and hello, all. Welcome back to Locked On Oklahoma State, your daily stop for all things Cowboy and Cowgirl related. My name is Cody Stovall. I'm going to thank you kindly for stopping by to make this your first listen. We're available on all of your podcasting platforms, visually as well on YouTube. Find me personally on X at All-Day State. Today, we're partially brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment matter more, especially right now when new customers can place a $5 bet and get started with $150 back in bonus bets. If your $5 hauler is a winner, make sure that you visit FanDuel.com to get started. Meanwhile, we get started in the conversation of the two newest additions to the Oklahoma State 2025 commit class. And if you have noticed, it put us, according to 247, from the number 61st ranked class to the number 55th ranked class, just primarily off of these two guys. Now, we do know that obviously whenever you have somebody coming in like Chandavian Bradley, the former four-star Missouri player, high school player of the year, went to Tennessee, and they had a lot of big plans for him. The objective when he went to Tennessee was to get him up from 215 pounds to around 240 pounds. They needed him 235, 245-ish range to do what they needed him to do as a Tennessee Volunteer. Obviously, he had a little bit of issue getting up to that weight in the beginning, so there was conversations about moving him to a tight end. He was not a fan of that idea. He wanted to remain on the defensive side of the ball, even if it meant a little bit of a different position grouping. And now he's a linebacker, which is precisely where he might fit at Oklahoma State. Coming in at 6'5", he clearly seems to be over that 240, 245 range. There's one publication that lists him at 255. That might be a bit rich, but nonetheless, he got to the weight that Tennessee needed him to get to be a viable member of their defensive line crew. So now that he's at that weight, we're going to be able to utilize him in that Colin Oliver style of role. There will be opportunities for him to get pressure on the quarterback, just like there will be opportunities for him to get out on the edge. So we don't have to battle with the potential weight gain issues because we're going to utilize his speed to our advantage as opposed to the Tennessee four-down system getting him bulked up. So on top of this, Mr. Chandavian Bradley, that used to be, again, Missouri Player of the Year, high four-star, originally committed to or chose Tennessee over OU and Auburn and several other SEC schools. So this is going to be a big get. And obviously he was able to get up to that 240 range in the last couple of years. We should be able to reap the benefits of that. And of course, when you see what Colin Oliver was able to do pre-injury, it does make a lot of sense. And then on the defensive line spot, we got the number 3 ranked defensive end in America coming out of the JUCO ranks, and Rashod Bradley. This is the Bradley times 2 connection, both coming from JUCO, number 1 ranked linebacker in the country, number 3 ranked defensive end in the country. And if you look at Rashod Bradley, when you look at his high school film, it equals the word raw. Like definitionally speaking, there wasn't a lot of technique. It was just him physically being able to blow by people and get in the backfield. He had a lot of tip balls that equaled interceptions for his defense, and not a lot of it was necessarily based on technique. It was just athletic ability. It seems as though he's been able to kind of wrangle that in as of recently. And one thing that does pop off on the JUCO film is he does have a relentless motor. Also, he plays a decent amount of defensive tackle and defensive end. So the multiple sets of utilization will be able to make him fit in somewhat seamlessly here at Oklahoma State. He's going to come in around 6'5", 225 pounds. So if he needs to gain a little bit of weight, that's a possibility, but it could be another option to have a flex dude that can kind of seamlessly rotate. If you have one guy that's performing that Von Miller style of role on one side of the field, if you could have another on the other side, that would be fantastic. And then if you could couple that with the athleticism of Jaleel Johnson and Deshaun Brown, you might be cooking in hot oil here. This is not even mentioning guys like Landon Dean, which I think are going to have a Brock Martin style level future in Stillwater, America. This is clearly indicative of the route that we plan on going. Obviously, the Deion Sanders mold is, lose however many guys, bring in 45, 55 transfers, and then do it again the next year. And then maybe you'll get that number down as time goes on. But the Oklahoma State mold has always been build from the high school ranks, and then fill via the transfer portal, plug and play where we need to. And clearly, according to Mike Gundy in his post-game press conference, that was an issue this season when it came to depth, because we decided to utilize some of the financial capabilities in retention of guys like Ollie Gordon, Alan Bowman, the offensive line, Kendall Daniels, Nick Martin, Colin Oliver. Instead of spending NIL or money in general on the retention side of things, this year we're shifting to spending money to go get guys out of the JUCO and transfer portal, because we need an instant influx of guys that are ready to be much more competitive. There is going to be a sour taste in this particular locker room. Some guys are not going to be able to shake that sour taste. Obviously, some guys are. There will be a discussion on what coaches likely are to be moving next, and I think that'll be showcased by how the transfer portal goes as far as the guys going out. With the guys coming in, to me, this seems to be an emphasis on the fact that we are going to retain some of the defensive guys, and the defensive linemen and linebackers that are coming in are going to be orchestrating within the new idea of what we're going to do defensively. I don't know that we'd be having a lot of massive shakeups, or shall I say a lot of big-time commits, if there was a lot of uncertainty about what we're going to be doing. So if we're going after two guys from the defensive line, one that can kind of flex and play that linebacker style of role as well, maybe this means it's a good indication that Paul Randolph is going to be rocking and rolling here a little bit further on, or maybe Joe Bob Clements is going to be getting a little bit of a different role. If it all is going to stay intact, we're still going to need an influx of immediate talent. The idea of building people up 2 to 3 years and getting them to that year 3 mark that Mike Gundy always feels much more comfortable with, it isn't necessarily going to be the right ticket moving forward, because we returned so many people, like 20 starters from this previous season, most of them being upperclassmen, as well as a lot of upperclassmen in the twos that also came back. And those were by more or less, by and large, a lot of the guys that have been here for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And so it was good in theory, but it didn't exactly work out the way that we needed to. And maybe there's some lackluster performances being caused by some of the, issues that we might have within the roster. I don't know that you can look at the field and say that a significant number of upperclassmen shouldn't potentially explore what their future is going to be at Oklahoma State or elsewhere. We need an injection of new blood. We just do. Not only from a player perspective, but obviously from a coaching perspective, which we're about to get to, but from the player side of things. If you can get a bunch of guys like Chandavian Bradley, who went to the SEC, played in the SEC for a little bit, and then, made a little bit of a change to get to where he is now, we're not going to need a lot of development, or at least that's the idea here. And I think the same can be said to some degree about Rashod Bradley. Rashod Bradley might have a little bit more time than Chandavian Bradley, but Chandavian Bradley is a big get. And again, I do think it emphasizes the fact that we're going to be going after a lot of JUCO and a lot of transfer portal guys. We knew numerically it was going to be a big number no matter what. We're going to lose 30, 35-ish guys just out of graduation and your potential NFL draft guys. That number does not include the transfer portal. We don't know if it's going to be a light year like last year where we had like 8 guys transfer out, or if it's going to be one of the bigger years where we have 22, 25, 26 guys transfer out. We've had a little bit of mix of both. What we have never had is a Colorado style of situation where you lose 45, 55 guys. But even if that's the case, there's clearly an emphasis on getting guys that are kind of plug and play. We're not getting a whole bunch of dudes that are going to take 2-3 years to kind of build up through the system. Now, you have to have a core nucleus, a foundation of those guys as well. And that's going to fall largely on some of the underclassmen, the redshirt freshmen, the sophomores that have, kind of been a part of the building blocks with the older guys, the Nick Martins of the world, that have been taught how to do things that way. But again, there is some negative involved with some of the upperclassmen as well that will make this whole thing very interesting. Another obvious thing that'll make a lot of this stuff very interesting is to see what coaches are let go. And that'll determine on what kind of relationships some of these players have. So naturally, some dudes, some coaches that go will cause some players to go. So that'll be the next big interesting thing to pay attention to, just like it's always fun to pay attention to the pocketbook with FanDuel. When you're trying to get your money right or your money bigger and you're an Oklahoma State fan, it's been a little bit rough, but that's okay because we know we've got several NFL Cowboys that are allowing to live out some of our FanDuel dreams. This is your opportunity to tackle the NFL action with America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get 150 bones back in bonus bets if it's a winner. The FanDuel app is going to give you everything you need to place live bets on NFL action all in one place. So when you get that hunch, that tingling sensation in the middle of the game that you know it's about to get wild and you can capitalize, go ahead and do that by checking the latest stats, viewing the live play-by-play, and so much more from the same place where you're going to place your bets from. Make sure that you visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 back in bonus bets if your first $5 bet is a winner. Make sure that you go to FanDuel.com because you never want to waste that tingling sensation in your loins ever again. Make every moment matter more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Okay, so this one doesn't need a long diatribe hooked up to it. It is what it is. I obviously expected Dickey to be let go quite some time ago. So the announcement of Dunn, Dickey, and McEndoo moving on should be pretty soon. Now, here's where I'm hearing it. It's a little bit of a different scenario than typical, right? So instead of firing people, what I'm assuming is happening, it's more of a coaxing into style of conversation. So instead of just out and out firing dudes, it's more of, all right, man, we really need to part ways. You really need to find another job. So that way all of this can go away somewhat amicably. And given all of Mike Gundy's comments over the years about not making any midseason moves or big-time firings because these people have families, so on and so forth, I could buy into some of that. If it's going to creep a little bit longer, though, that's where I would have some concerns. But on top of that, I think it also accentuates some of the future transfer portal moves that we're going to have happen. But yeah, there's absolutely no way that Mike Gundy is not getting at least enough pressure from Chad Weiberg, who's not getting at least enough pressure from Dr. Kasey Shrum to make something happen. I think some of these conversations were had to some degree this previous year. And as I've said previously, I wasn't a big fan of the idea of Mike Gundy basically putting his back in the corner and saying, I'm not doing anything. I'm not firing Dunn. I'm not firing Dickey or McEndoo or Rattay. I'm not shifting anything. We're just going to keep things status quo, and hopefully we're going to have the biggest season of all time. Unfortunately, that idea didn't work. I was pretty adamant about how ridiculous I thought it was that Kasey Dunn's getting more time because there's absolutely no way physically possible for Mike Gundy to tell anybody that Kasey Dunn has been a successful offensive coordinator at any point in time during his tenure as Oklahoma State OC. So him not making any moves offensively last year, it's I don't know. It's okay because he did make a Big 12 title appearance. We did reel off a lot of phenomenal wins there towards the end of the season to make the latter half of the season much, much more different and much more enjoyable than the beginning. But there is absolutely no metrics that anybody can say Kasey Dunn is good. And furthermore, there's always going to be an argument that he could potentially be moved back down to wide receiver coach. Number one, I don't think his ego will allow him to do that after ascending the way that he has. And secondarily, the last wide receiver that we've put into the NFL that has done things successfully was Tylan Wallace, which was right around the time we were making the move from Kasey Dunn as a wide receiver coach to Kasey Dunn as an offensive coordinator. Since Kasey Dunn has been a full-time OC, the only person that's really got any semblance of an opportunity in the NFL has been Tay Martin. And Tay Martin's kind of battled third string practice squad up and down with the San Francisco 49ers. He still continued to do it. So if you want to say that Kasey Dunn is responsible for Tay Martin's development and his spot in the league, I guess we can go with that. But outside of that, there hasn't been anybody else. So the lineage of top-ranked wide receivers that Kasey Dunn was getting to Oklahoma State, developing and putting into the NFL has died down significantly since he's become the offense coordinator. So maybe he can coach the dudes up. I don't think anyone's going to argue that. He can even, to some degree, recruit those same level of guys because wide receiver not typically is an issue for us in the recruiting department, regardless of what the record is or how the team looks. But to say that we've, been able to uphold the Kasey Dunn era, putting guys in the wide receiver virtually every single year or every other year at the least, that has died down tremendously. So I don't even know if him going down to wide receiver coach is going to be a positive outlook. If you're going to get a new offensive coordinator, I think a lot of us would prefer somebody who has a background as a quarterback or maybe a wide receiver. Even that's a little bit of a stretch, right? But if you find a new offense coordinator that wants to keep Tim Rattay around, that's going to be another thing that's somewhat problematic. The benefit Mike Gundy has with having the most or second most tenured staff in America next to Utah is whenever you do bring somebody in like a Brian Nardo, but you're keeping, Coach Hammersmith at safeties, Coach Duffy's at cornerbacks, Coach Joe Bob at linebackers. You got Paul Randolph at defensive lineman, and you had Greg Richmond before that. So when you bring somebody in to be the DC, it is a little bit odd that he's going to come in with his, system, try to implement it, but he's got to do it with all of the returning staff. Now, in theory, from a continuity standpoint, that seemed like a brilliant move, but obviously there's a disconnect somewhere, just like there's a disconnect offensively with the talent that is on the roster. Now, I personally get a little frustrated when people try to convince us that there is no talent on this roster. To me, it's not a matter of talent. It's a matter of mismanaging the talent that we do have. Now, with that being said, what are we going to do on the defensive side of the ball, right? Nardo's, I'm guessing right now, like 60-40. 60% he stays, 40% he's gone, which isn't great. But at the same time, if Brian Nardo is going to get more time, it's likely because he was being put or forced to do things that he didn't necessarily agree with or play guys that he didn't think fit into the system. And if some of that headbutting is between him and Gundy or him and Joe Bob, that would be somewhat indicative of the guys that we do, in fact, move on from, in my opinion. I don't think there's any way that we keep all of the defensive coaches. I would imagine at least 3 or 4 go. And if that's not including Nardo, then perhaps Joe Bob, Coach Duffy, decide to take their talents elsewhere. Outside of that, I don't know, because I highly doubt you'd get rid of Coach Hammersmith. The safeties haven't been much of an issue, but maybe Joe Bob wants to have the opportunity to move up. So could it be that Joe Bob moves up and then we do, in fact, get rid of Brian Nardo? That will be determined. To my knowledge, the defensive staff arrangements are going to take a little bit more time. There's going to be a little bit more of an evaluation stage. There doesn't need to be any evaluation stage whatsoever on Dunn, Dickey, and McEndoo. And again, I think that it's very viable for people to throw Tim Rattay and Brian Nardo in that same conversation, but just being out on the road, hitting the recruiting trail, things of that nature are some of the reasons that I think guys like Nardo and Rattay might have the opportunity to come back, on top of neither one of those dudes have much of a voice when it comes to overriding particular guys. So maybe the overriding needs to be combative, whatever, with new staff. And on top of that, in my opinion, you got to bring a staff in or offensive coordinator that has the audacity and the ability to tell Mike Gundy, no, we're not going to do that. I'm not going to play that guy. I'm not going to run that scheme. I'm going to do this and then get out of the way. That doesn't happen very often. But I think if there's enough pressure to get Mike Gundy to make some of these moves, there's also got to be some pressure like Boone and Holder over the Dana Holgerson deal. Like, no, you don't understand. You have to make this kind of move. This is not you get to do whatever you want, pick whoever you want, and try to unearth the next D3 talent. This is a time where you need to hire somebody that will and can tell you, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not playing that guy. I'm not going with that set. It is what it is. And I think the same can be said defensively. either hire a guy to do his own thing like Jim Knowles did, even though the Jim Knowles system was different. Mike Gundy tried to learn some of it, but Knowles was just kind of kooky and a little bit out there. But that was the last coach that just hands-free got to do his own thing. You got to go back to like a Todd Monken and a Dana Holgorsen before you get that on the offensive side of the ball. So if Mike Gundy's going to do the CEO role, I don't have a problem with it. I don't think most of the fan base does. But if he's going to do the CEO role, then he needs to hire people that are competent enough to run things fairly smoothly without his involvement. His involvement needs to be the checks and balances. Don't think it needs to be as daily or hourly as he's had to be involved the last couple of years. If he's going to do the CEO approach, which I think was the idea behind, allowing guys like Kasey Dunn and Rob Glass to kind of orchestrate things on his behalf when he happened to be gone. If you're going to do that, that's fine. You just have to make sure the guys running things are competent and capable, because Kasey Dunn was neither. It is what it was. It is what it is. Well, whatever. I can't speak sometimes, and that's fine. All right, so I think that for the foreseeable future, after the offensive staff shakeups seem to be inevitably going to happen, I don't think you have to jump out on a ledge or be a rocket scientist to presume that Mike Gundy's, again, getting enough pressure to have to make some changes, some of them big, some of them, not necessarily are going to be earth-shattering, but enough moves need to be made. Now, if we think that it makes sense, it's the most logical thing that we can come up with, that there's going to be no Dunn, no Dickey, no McEndoo pretty soon. Then what about Brian Nardo? What about Joe Bob Clements? What about Tim Duffy? Now, I would imagine Tim Duffy's gone regardless, just because there's been a regression since Christian Holmes left. And we haven't been able to retain a lot of the cornerbacks on top of the regression at that position. But outside of Coach Tim Duffy, I don't think we're going to let Randolph after 1 year, right? I mean, the D-line also did a decent amount of regression, but maybe that's not on Paul Randolph. So in my opinion, if there's grumblings of Brian Nardo getting removed, then I think there's going to be a little bit of a precursor with that. As in, if you have guys like Landon Cleveland and David Kabongo and Yamil Talib and Jonathan Agumadu, if you have those kind of guys start to enter the portal, then I think it's a foregone conclusion that Nardo's also going to be going with them. But if we are able to keep a lot of those guys and you don't hear about them in the portal, to me, that would indicate that Brian Nardo is going to be kind of safe. Now, how does that shake out between Joe Bob and Nardo? I don't know. I really firmly feel like we're going to keep one of those gentlemen. I firmly believe we're not going to keep both of those gentlemen. So I think it'll be kind of interesting whenever the decommit portal starts to kind of happen. When that window opens, it'll be whom enters their name to leave in the portal. I think that'll be most indicative on what coaches are verbally on the hot seat. Because the players aren't going to know everything that's going on, of course, but they will know just little hints in there, here and there. If the communication starts to drop off, let's say a player talks to Nardo every other day, and that starts to drop off, maybe there's some issues, and then maybe you see groups of those guys getting together and at least having the discussion on what December 3rd will look like as far as entering the transfer portal. I also feel like that it'll take a little bit of time to shake out who the new hires are going to be. So some of these guys are going to stick around for at least the spring to see what that looks like. So you have a multitude of windows here. To me, it'll be interesting based on what names are coming into the portal window whenever that window starts to open. I think that'll have a direct tie on which coaches are obviously on the hot seat, getting to 1-year deals, possibly being fired, already looking for a replacement. Because, again, the kids aren't not going to know everything, but there is going to be some telltale signs that give them indications on, I don't think it looks good for my favorite coach. And if you have a lot of upperclassmen, like entering the portal, to me, that indicates that we're losing some of the old guard. And then it's the opposite if we have a bunch of the freshmen, redshirt freshmen starting to jump in the portal. To me, that indicates a little bit of a lost love between guys like Nardo and Paul Randolph. But perhaps these two big-time JUCO gets will be enough to at least kind of put a temporary hold, temporary Band-Aid, if you will, on the current situation. So we shall see how it all shakes out. Let me know down in the comment section what you feel about rebuilding via the transfer portal and the JUCO route, and what that looks like for the final roster shakeup kind of numbers. I also want to give a shout out to Friends. They just lost their round 2 game. And, it was sad because they were up 17-7 at halftime. They were in firm control of the game. But, they went conservative mode. And I tweeted as soon as the third quarter started, and it was very clear what we were doing, is bleeding the clock down to a few seconds before we snapped the ball. I tweeted that, going conservative mode and just simply trying to bleed the clock to hang on to a lead takes you out of rhythm, and it usually spells disaster. It can cause the other team to regain momentum and come back and cause problems, and that is precisely what happened. So they let a 17-7 halftime lead go, and, lost 21-17. So shout out to Friends, making it to round 2. You had the number 2 team in America, not only on the ropes, but I personally think if the Falcons come out in the second half and they stay aggressive and they don't try to bleed the clock and they stay in rhythm and they keep the pressure on Grandview, I think the game probably turns out different. But I've never been a big fan of bleeding the clock and trying to hang on to a W. That's what happened. And it backfired. So it is what it is. It'll be a lesson learned. Thankfully, Friends returns like 80-85% of this particular roster. So they'll have another opportunity next season to make a big run. And, if we're just aggressive the whole time, maybe it looks different. So shout out to Friends, getting a playoff W, having a phenomenal season, winning a KCAC title, and almost taking down the number 2 team in America. This close, but it is what it is. And that's all we're going to have for this one right here. As always, I love you. God bless. Go Pokes. Thank you for tuning in to make this your first listen here on Locked On Oklahoma State. You could be anywhere, so happy you choose to be here. Like it if you like the daggone thing, dislike, that's okay too. More importantly, share, comment, and subscribe. My podcast people out there. You're the bricks, the bread, the butter, the fondue, funny stuff, funky stuff. You're all of it. You know the drill. Hit the stars, leave a review, do what you do. Later, taters. Now we get to shift to other sports, recruiting, transfers, the whole 9 yards. It'll be fun.